while that's happening, we just like to acknowledge that we are speaking from the land of the Tongva, and that we acknowledge their heritage and their place in our society. Thank you for having us. I'm going to start, and Sam's going to come in and talk about the really important stuff. I'm going to do a little context. Greetings from Los Angeles this afternoon. Sam, next slide. Los Angeles is a giant place, 503 square miles. It is in some ways the iconic peripheral city. As we know from books such as McWilliams's Island on the Land, Fogelson's Fragmented Metropolis, Heiss's Magnetic Los Angeles, Cuff's Provisional City. Seems like every decade there's another version of how Los Angeles is a peripheral or a suburbanized city. I give you this, there's lots of images of Los Angeles, but I like this one for people to get a sense of the scale. We're going to be talking a little bit about Milwaukee and San Francisco up there, and Minneapolis and the San Fernando Valley. But just keep in mind that this is Los Angeles, this incredibly large, very complicated geography. Sam. So Los Angeles had started out in 1880 with almost no one, and by 1930, 1950 was a pretty large city. And the area we're going to be talking about is that period between 1950 and really 1970. 1970 is the moment we're really going to be talking about. And so I wanted to show this population it's really by place, not by sector. And so you can see the big blue line that there's an increase in population in the central part of Los Angeles. It's small. You can see there's a small increase in the western parts of Los Angeles. And you can see there's a small increase in the harbor. And you can see that there's an enormous increase in the San Fernando Valley, home of Leave It to Beaver, the Brady Bunch, and dozens of other iconic suburban television shows and other images of the idea of the suburban space. On the left is that plan that's going to come up in 1970 that we're going to talk about. And those dots at the top there, the 2, 3, 4, 2, that 2 is the San Fernando Valley. Sam? So suburbanization is often and appropriately attached to the car in Los Angeles history, but in reality, suburbanization and the skeleton of suburbanization really came earlier in the first decades of the 20th century, when Los Angeles had one of the largest, if not the largest, public transit systems in the United States. It went all the way from, as you can see up there, San Fernando, all the way down to Long Beach and into Orange County. It went all the way from the Pacific Ocean and Santa Monica all the way, and it actually goes off the map here to San Bernardino. It's an enormously large space. And this, of course, was created by, much of it was created by Mr. Huntington as a way to sell land and to suburbanize the area. Sam? The car then reinforces this and fills it in. This is the 5 freeway going through the San Fernando Valley. Forgive the slide, that's a little weird. And the extraordinary expansion of housing. The one thing that people forget that Greg Heiss did so beautifully in Magnetic Los Angeles is Los Angeles has many bedroom communities, but most of their communities are actually working communities, industrial communities. And this is not a suburbanization by bedroom. It's really a suburbanization by work. Sam? So the result is this polycentric, peripherally oriented city. By the middle of the 1960s, it's competing nodes around the city and around the county. The center, which had been actually quite strong in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, was diminished dramatically during this period of suburbanization. Richard Longstreth, in his extraordinary book on regional center to city city center to regional mall, talks about how 30% of the population entered each day to downtown in 1930, and by 1954 it was just about 5 or 6%. This incredible diminishment of the center that remained a diminished space all the way through the decades that follow what we're going to talk about today. Sam? The reality is that this created an extraordinary circumstance where dispersion created environmental hazards. It created incredible opportunities for people to live. It also created dangerous circumstances. This is a smoggy day in 1964, at a time in which the air quality people would tell people to take 100 to 150 days a year where they didn't go out of the house. For a long time, this was fought over. They hoped to have industry change this, and then they suddenly realized the car was doing it. And this was the basis for a conversation that begins in the middle of the 1960s and really becomes then part of a bureaucratic conversation in the city planning office starting in 66, 67, 68. And what they have hired Cal Hamilton, who is a person who believes very strongly in analysis. He believes in the idea of using numbers to tell what can happen. And they then take on, and just an extraordinary choice, they take on one of the earliest and most prevalent citizen participation processes we know of, where they engage 60,000 people in conversations about what should happen. And they eventually come down to 4 ideas, Sam, 4 ideas for a plan. Sam is going to take us from these 4 ideas, the centers, the dispersed, the corridors, and the low density, to what became known as the LA Centers Plan in 1970, was presented back to the public. They had this extraordinary public participation, and they were advised by Kevin Lynch. And with that, Sam, it's yours.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, as Professor Sloane said, in 1967, the City Planning Department released a report called Concepts for Los Angeles that discussed 4 major approaches to improving Los Angeles in the coming decades. Each of these 4, the primary difference between these 4 were how they sort of tackled medium and high density development. Each of them, including centers, sort of made their peace with a reliance on single family housing for the bulk of the population, but differed on other densities. So the centers approach focused on high density urban development in specific centers throughout the city, whereas the dispersed approach favored low and medium density development scattered sort of throughout the series, throughout the cities, the city. The corridors approach again sought to preserve single family housing in much of the city, but it was punctuated by medium density corridors emanating from a highly dense urban center. Finally, the low density approach aimed to restrict most housing to single family and establish a 4 million resident ceiling on the city's total population. 3 years later, in 1970, the Department of City Planning released another report called the Centers Concept, where planners argued that none of these 4 approaches in and of themselves were adequate to addressing Los Angeles's needs in the coming decades. So they decided to focus especially on centers, but incorporate elements from all 4. In doing so, they sort of outlined 8 main goals for planning in Los Angeles going forward. The first was to, again, preserve low density residential character of the city, preserve existing single family housing from the encroachment of other uses, rehabilitate single family homes when needed, and make that single family housing available to Angelenos of all strata. The next goal was to provide maximum convenience for the residents of high and medium density housing. and to locate such housing near dense commercial centers and employment opportunities. One such commercial center is pictured here, a rendering from the 1970 report. The next goal was to provide employment and commercial opportunities in places convenient for all residents of the city. And relatedly, the next goal to provide adequate transportation for all residents through the expansion of transit in order to alleviate traffic and offer residents more transportation choices. And here again, from the 1970 report, a rendering of a park and ride. So they aim to create a vast new network of rail and increase bus service to farther parts of the city. The next goal was to provide needed public services for all residents by expanding the network of public and open spaces and facilities throughout the city. In particular, planners focused on facilities like recreational facilities, preserving the shoreline for public use, and in addition, conserving the city's natural resources and amenities. The final goal was to, again, relatedly, enhance the quality of the city's physical environment by integrating all aspects of the city's development through the application of urban design principles. And here you can see, this is a rendering again from the 70 report, a proposed recreational use of flood control channels. So this could have been say the LA River or Bologna Creek. So all this is to say that the center's plan sought to promote high density development while protecting many existing single family districts from rezoning. So getting a little more into the weeds, in order to do this, the plan proposed the development of dozens of medium to high density centers throughout the city, 29 in LA proper and 48 in the surrounding unincorporated Los Angeles County. To Professor Sloane's point, this was again building on LA's existing polycentric development and kind of playing, with this idea of what is center, what is periphery. Interestingly, although it did not use the term explicitly, the plan proposed mixed-use development in these high-density centers, an approach well ahead of its time. At the heart of this plan were what planners called multiple function structures, incorporating housing, transit connections, commercial activity, and publicly accessible open space. Despite this mixed-use character, however, the plan took pains to physically separate cars from pedestrians and as well as from transit. And here in this rendering, you can kind of see that at work, the great physical grade distance between pedestrian walkways on the side, roadways at the center, and then transit corridors below and above the roadways. So in addition, emanating from these centers would be areas of medium density development, chiefly housing. And you can kind of see it in this diagram where these areas could connect physically to centers themselves. Planners called these nodes, and where they were physically separate, these were known as satellites. Outside these centers, nodes and satellites, planners sought to protect the low density character of suburban neighborhoods while providing more amenities and industrial jobs there. At the same time, new rail infrastructure would focus on connecting centers to each other and surrounding nodes, while expanded bus service would link the new system to outlying single family neighborhoods. Again, getting back to that park and ride rendering we saw previously. And finally, planners aimed to expand the city's network of open space, but relied primarily on smaller open spaces, limiting the need for large-scale land purchases. As such, planners argued that the proposal could preserve much of the city's single-family housing stock while encouraging more residents to take transit, thereby reducing smog. Interestingly, planners also envisioned a much, much denser city with high-density districts of more than 40 dwelling units per acre. Just for context, in the largely suburban San Fernando Valley, a typical district has around 5 to 8 dwelling units per acre, so a much, much bigger, denser city. And if adopted, officials predicted the plan would result in a Los Angeles of around 10 or 11 million people within the coming decades. And again, just for context, LA's population has hovered just below 4 million for the past several decades. So very different place. Despite these grand ambitions, the plan was not a success for a lot of complex reasons. It was adopted as part of the general plan of 1974, and the city council approved it a year later, but it was significantly weakened. In addition, planners did not predict the dramatic slowdown in population growth in the decades after 1970. Beyond that, there was sort of a double-edged sword of community empowerment. Professor Sloane mentioned that around 60,000 people participated in the initial planning process prior to the report's release. And that's pretty significant for its time. But following its approval, the plan ran into significant homeowner and developer opposition, particularly to higher density development. As a result, LA largely lost its chance to be at the forefront of planning reform at that time. In addition, kind of compounding these challenges, changes in local and state law undercut the plan's chances in important ways. The story of Proposition 13 will be familiar to any Californian. From 1978, it dramatically reduced the municipal tax base available to city planners, and therefore reduced the scope of sort of these grander ambitions. But even more to the point is the story of Proposition U, a citywide ordinance adopted in 1986 that led to a dramatic reduction in commercial zoning density. And again, it's kind of a story of the power of single-family homeowners opposed to that density. Proposition U passed by around 69% of the vote, and it sort of, in effect, it capped the city's population at about 4 million people. This downzoning doomed many of the plan's proposed high-density centers, and further exacerbated LA's housing crisis. So despite the plan's promise to increase density and activity around urban centers, the result has been a more dispersed city and largely flat population growth in the decade since 1970. Still, the center's plan provided an early glimpse of approaches which now punctuate urban planning in important ways, from the critical role of community participation to mixed-use developments and schools like new urbanism, to current debates over transit-oriented development. So even though the center's plan ultimately failed, the principles it embodied continue to impact urban America in profound ways.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Are we? We're finished with the presentation. So
We're done.
yeah, okay, yeah. Just caught me out a little bit. I was just typing in the chat to you're actually ahead of time, so I was just busy typing to wind things up. But that's fantastic. Ahead of schedule. That's always handy for question time. So thanks very much to both of you. Fascinating talk. I think one or two of you might have seen in the chat box there that that diagram of the separation of modes of transport looks suspiciously like a very, very famous one, at least in British circles, in a report called Traffic in Towns. So I wonder whether the artists were looking at each other's work. Certainly Colin Buchanan, who I think was the author of that report, I'm certain was looking at Los Angeles. He was involved with several consulting reports looking at, for example, South Hampshire, which I'm familiar with, which was at one point being likened to a potential LA sprawl. And I'm sure he was getting some of his ideas or going backwards and forwards with the Los Angeles example by the looks of it. So fascinating stuff. I will throw it open to people to make comments, ask questions. I already see one hand up. If anyone else wants to get in there, you can raise a hand like Roger has done using the reaction function, or just put your screen on and wave at us. So over to Roger for your question, comment.
Roger, for just a second. Cal Hamilton was a leading figure in American planning and was very cognizant of trends in European and American planning. So it would not surprise me at all as if there was some sort of connection between more than one drawing in the piece. Roger.
Hi, thanks. Yes, that was fascinating. Great. Good to see. Always good to see images and plans of LA. I'm wondering about a couple of things. Maybe you can comment on. It's interesting when you see a plan, even a comprehensive plan like the one that you were talking about, is what's not in the plan, what's not there. So first of all, for anybody who's ever been in LA and who's lived in LA, we know that the boundaries of the city of LA is largely fictional. I mean, you never would know that when you drive through LA, that you're in LA or out of LA. And so if you look at the urban region, even in the 1970s, which when LA County maybe hard to say, maybe 7 million people, already, bursting at its seams. But largely just outside is the largest industrial area outside of the Ruhr area in Germany. You have the ports, you have all those kinds of things, and only one of the ports is in Los Angeles proper. You have the whole coastal communities. All of those things are not on this plan. And so I'd like you to say a few things about that. Then the other thing which is not on the plan, this is 1970. This is only a few years, 5 years after the Watts Rebellion, which questioned the idea of the cohesion of LA and asked question about visibility and invisibility and racial justice and all that, to in a way that then we had to wait a generation until the riots of 1992 to get back to that same level of intensity of debate inside the urban region, how to deal with the difference, many differences we lived with in LA, and I lived in LA at the time, so I'm sort of feel very much part of that conversation. And thirdly, what's also not in the plan, and I didn't hear you make a comment on it, but I sort of facetiously put in the chat that this is the blueprint for Bunker Hill, is of course at that time when that plan was made, the Community Redevelopment Agency, or basically the urban renewal process by federal and California law, produced centers in Century City, but also in Bunker Hill, in places like that. So in a way, in reality, much of the outside of the plan was actually happening while the plan wasn't happening. So maybe you can say a little bit about that, because particularly sort of the CRA and that whole process, which really started seriously under Tom Bradley, and those kinds of things, they just took off in the 1970s and into the 1980s, and really created the modern LA that we see today, with sort of masses of cities and all that didn't really exist before 1970.
Sam, could you put the PowerPoint back up in the second slide for me? I'm going to let Sam talk about some things, but let me talk about the race first. And that is, while he does this, you can go back to any slide that shows the map of the centers, okay? Race was clearly something which they were very concerned about in the planning department, but also very fragile. They were unwilling to confront. And so race is really not discussed in the plan at all. The idea of a unified city remains what they're trying to fight for. I will say that they did a couple of things with the plan that were responsive both to the issue about Watts and to the boundaries issue. This is a plan for the city of Los Angeles, but a good third of these dots of these proposed centers are not in the city of Los Angeles. This plan was in its bones a regional plan. It looked at Santa Monica, at Palos Verdes or Hermosa Beach. It also includes at least 2 or 3 centers in South Los Angeles, which at this time was a place, a heavily Black place that was largely ignored economically throughout the period that you're talking about, the period from the whole period up until, you know, very recently, when we finally built a light rail through South Los Angeles and began to restructure the economy there. And so one, the boundaries, I think they recognized that they couldn't do a plan for Los Angeles. And I think it's one of Hamilton's most radical and thoughtful ideas, is that you would actually reach out. And then on the last one, the CRA, so the only difference, you're absolutely correct. Outside of the plan, you're getting Century City. You're beginning to get some central node development in around Universal Studios or Universal City. You're getting some in downtown, and then you're getting some along the Wilshire corridor. At the same time, these were supposed to be more robust than any of those places. So you still can't get to Century City by public transit except for a bus, and it's not a great connection. It's still hard until right now, until the last 10 years, to get to Universal Studios, Universal City. And so in some sense, yes, private development is imagining centers, and the city is allowing them to build centers, but they're not actually doing it in the systematic way that the plan proposed. And I would argue that that's a major difference. The only real center that gets built is Warner Center in the Valley. One could make an argument that that the Wilshire corridor has some version of a center, and yet in neither case were they willing or able to build strong public transit to connect those centers to anything until after the 1990s. And this is a whole nother part of a conversation, is the battle over the money for public transit, which was defeated 3 times in the 70s and 80s. And then finally we get the first of the designated monies for public transit, and that has continued to be true ever since.
I don't disagree with you at all about those places, but there's also Santa Monica and West Hollywood, as the densest place west of the Mississippi, residentially the densest place outside of San Francisco. Those places become incredibly dense during those years, so much so that in 1984 West Hollywood becomes a city of its own because it can. Santa Monica, attractive as a residential community, becomes a very, by California standards, a fairly dense residential community. And there are a few others like that. And I think that also takes place. And the other big omission of this is, of course, it's Long Beach, which takes off as a fairly dense subcenter. And then we're not even talking about some of the other ones in the other valleys that also take off. They're not ever going to be New York, but they did look substantially different from that low density LA that existed earlier in the century.
Oh, there's no doubt that density increases dramatically through the last half of the 20th century. The question becomes, is it planned or is it private? And with Proposition U, it becomes much more difficult. I mean, we live in a world right now in Los Angeles where $1 million house is a regular kind of house. And one of the reasons is Proposition U essentially said, you can't build 2 units, duplexes, triplexes, quads. You can only build a single family house on something like 60% of the land in the city. And so in some sense, yes, the private developer, the reason that private developers were opposed to the plan is they wanted to be able to build stuff anywhere. And they did, and they have, but they've undone it largely outside of the plans, right? They've done it with amendments to the general plan. They've done it through amendments to specific plans, which has led to another whole battle in Los Angeles around Proposition S and other places where people have been trying to rein in the city council's ability to say, oh, I'm going to put a tower there. And in places like Santa Monica, where the planning is much stronger, they have essentially built density that it has a pretty severe cap, right? Because they won't do height. They won't go vertical in Santa Monica beyond 4 or 5 stories. They have a lot of 4 or 5 stories. My colleague Jen Giuliano made the argument in the 90s that Los Angeles was the best example of horizontal density certainly in the United States. And that was literally where New York has this enormous density in Manhattan and in other places. And Los Angeles doesn't even come close to it. But Los Angeles actually is a denser metropolitan area because we have 60 miles of relative density going from Santa Monica all the way into the San Gabriel Valley. And so it's this battle that goes on and on throughout this period. And this plan is a good example of that battle. But your questions are well taken. Sam, do you want to add something quick?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's also important to keep in mind that when we move from like a centrally planned polycentric city to private developers kind of being able to build where and when they want to, there's a lot that can be criticized about it. I mean, you mentioned not talking about the Watts insurrection in this plan only 5 years later. That's a significant omission. But at the same time, there's a lot of talk in this plan about inclusivity, about housing for all Angelenos, and not a direct result of this plan kind of failing, but in a decade since, it seems in a lot of ways, planners have abandoned that language, and private developers don't seem willing to pick it back up.